I wanted to talk to you guys about a showdown between China and Taiwan that has now gotten deadly. I'm not seeing this talked about really at all in the Western press. So I feel like I should get ahead of the game in case the story blows up, or this ends up spiraling into a bigger crisis. And even if it doesn't spiral out into a bigger crisis, which I think odds are, and God willing, it will not, but there's a good chance that in the future, we're gonna see a lot more crises like this. We're gonna see a lot more confrontations like this, either purposefully or because people tried to engage in some risk brinkmanship and then failed, and then this is the result, which might be why this happened in the first place. And so even if this particular confrontation, showdown, and incident doesn't lead to a war, or which of course we're still way far from that conversation, or doesn't lead to an escalation of tensions, doesn't lead to anything, this style of crisis we're probably going to see a lot more of in the future as the Chinese push to see where they can probe inside Taiwan's defenses and where they can establish the new normative line for how far they can push the Taiwanese as they try to probe further and further and further, while not doing any big moves to avoid any possible counter response from the United States. Let's check this out. This is from Taiwan Plus News, explaining some of the basics of the confrontation. By the way, Taiwan Plus News, well, I mean, I don't know if I'd call them the best in the area. If you want English-based Taiwanese coverage, this is a decent enough place to get some news from.
It's been 2 weeks since the deaths of 2 Chinese fishers near Taiwan's outlying Jinmen Islands in an encounter with Taiwan's Coast Guard, and tensions between the two countries are ratcheting up. Taiwanese officials in Jinmen were scheduled to meet with their Chinese counterparts on Friday, but were left waiting by the Chinese side.
We are still giving priority to the law enforcement. One second, let me read this. I know I have people who just listen. We are still giving priority to the law enforcement of the Maritime Patrol. No matter what, we must try to protect the safety. The Coast Guard enforcing the law. This is a debate between, well, I don't want to say debate, but more somebody getting confronted by a legislator from the ruling DPP party, which is seen as the more, I would say, not only the more progressive party, Democratic Progressive Party after all, but a lot more pro-independence, much more confrontational with China, much more, we are independent Taiwan, even if we don't have to declare it, it is our affairs, we don't like your encroachment. And he's responding, the Coast Guard enforcing the law or approaching vehicles. But we can't allow our territorial waters to be violated. We can't allow it. But we must insist on the legitimacy. Okay, I'm sorry. They're debating over each other. It's hard for me to translate. You could have read it yourself. But they're going back and forth with the government official largely trying to say, look, we don't want to escalate. We don't want to escalate with the Chinese. We don't want a war. We don't want a war. These 2 sailors dying was a tragedy. And the DPP legislator responding, we were guarding our territorial waters. Those fishermen were in our waters when their boat capsized and they drowned. They shouldn't have been in our waters. We cannot play games with their territorial sovereignty. If we are pushed back here, then they'll push us back from the new place. We cannot lose ground is generally the argument that's going on.
The intended talks were aimed at resolving an incident in mid-February when a Chinese speedboat trying to flee from Taiwan's Coast Guard capsized, causing the deaths of 2 of the men on board. China has responded angrily to the incident, increasing its own Coast Guard patrols around Jinmen and putting more pressure on Taiwan.
Now, Jinmen is an island that's close to China. For those, I think it'll show a map here in a second, so I could just point you to it. Oh, well, there you go. Very convenient.
Jinmen is roughly 10 kilometers.
Yeah, so this is very, very close to China itself. In fact, this has been the center of multiple crises with mainland China and Taiwan before. In fact, there was the Taiwan Strait crisis in the 50s between Taiwan and China, where the Chinese started pummeling this island with artillery and blaring propaganda messages at the island day after day after day, while the Taiwanese tried to stay here. Now, why the Taiwanese stayed in this island, considering how close it is to China, there's a few reasons, but the obvious one when it comes to the position of Chiang Kai-shek is Chiang Kai-shek always wanted to reconquer mainland China. And so having an outpost on a location like here, of course, would be very helpful for something like that. He was also, of course, a Chinese nationalist, and he didn't want to give up any more land to the communists after they had already given them all of mainland China. There, of course, are also some people who do live on the island. Nowadays, though, the island is a lot less divisive. That crisis was shut down by the United States intervening on Taiwan's half, and the Soviet Union, funnily enough, telling China to, yo, chill, dude, we don't want a war over this, and they pulled back. Nowadays, there is tourism that comes from mainland China onto the island, and it's a little different. Obviously, the tensions aren't as great, but the Taiwanese, knowing that the mainland government in China, the CCP, still claim their territory, want to protect their territorial waters, want to protect their land, and they're worried that if they allow the Chinese to violate the sovereignty of this island, then it can start a precedent where the Chinese will move on to other islands. First Kinmen, then Taiwan is the idea. Kinmen, then Taipei. So they, of course, have naval vessels over here that are protecting the sovereignty of this island as well.
From China, and there are concerns that Beijing will use this opportunity to create a new normal and maintain its heightened levels of patrol.
And this is the exact type of stuff that would terrify me for a crisis where Chinese fishermen violate what is designated by Taipei to be their territorial waters. Their ships come out, confront them. The ship ran away, capsized, 2 people die. China then says, in order to save lives and protect the territorial sovereignty of what we deem to be Chinese territory, they send ships over to the location of their death, and they push back the territorial waters from 8 kilometers to 7, then to 6, then to 5, then they make it non-existent, then the island. That's the fear.
China's strategy is clearly to continue this activity and to escalate and escalate and escalate. This pattern that we've seen from China over the years of using the pretext of some event, it could be a tragedy, it could be an incident of some sort, and then to use that as the pretext by which it then takes that next step and then settles everybody in at that next new normal, so that then there can be in the future another new normal.
Beijing has long seen Taiwan as part of its own territory and has tried to normalize its military presence in the region, frequently flying fighter jets and sailing warships near Taiwan. On Saturday, Taiwan reported 9 Chinese military aircraft and 8 warships around the country. 4 of those planes breached Taiwan's Air Defense Identification Zone, or ADIZ, which is not sovereign territory but acts as a buffer for defensive purposes. Although Chinese warplanes have never flown into Taiwan's airspace, its aircraft have been flying closer to the country than ever before, frequently crossing this area known as the Median Line, which is an unofficial boundary created by the U.S. in the 1950s. China's military says the boundary is nothing more than part of its territory.
台湾是中国领土不可分割的一部分，根本不存在所谓的海峡中线。
But Taiwan says the median line is integral to preventing conflict as it establishes limits and boundaries for both sides.
So this is the thing that scares me, right? Now, it's not that the median line is the most important thing in the world, right? Like, if this median line did ultimately, in some compromise, get moved back like 5 or 10 more miles, like, I don't think that would ultimately, like, oh my God, it's been moved 10 miles, Taiwan has fallen, Taipei has fallen, Chiang Kai-shek is doing fucking cartwheels in his grave. No. But the problem is if you concede on this and move back 5, 10, 15, 20, then that will encourage the Chinese to think, oh shit, that worked. Let's do it again. It's the idea of appeasement. But on the other angle, and this is the thing that scares me more than just a question of appeasement, which is the key word of the last few years, it seems to be. The other concern is brinksmanship. The Chinese are testing Taiwanese airspace. The Chinese are testing Taiwanese territorial waters, and now it has turned deadly. Now, this isn't the first time there's ever been any deadly confrontation here, but with tensions high and now a deadly clash, you could see how something like this could spiral. And so let's say instead of a Chinese fishing boat, it was a Chinese military jet. And the Chinese military jet, while doing maneuvers by next to a Taiwanese interceptor, something goes wrong. One plane hits another plane, it crashes, and there's a collision, one goes down. somebody misreads the situation, opens fire. There's some human element of mistake. There's some malfunction that is misread. Something happens. There's an element of risk here. And in fact, I think the risk might be part of the Chinese strategy. The idea that they're waiting for something to either happen to A, bring up a crisis to move back the line, to get more concessions from mainland Taiwan, maybe one that would have been, maybe Thailand would have been more considerate of these demands if there was a different government in there than a very pro, and I wouldn't say, when I say pro-independence, I mean pro-Taiwanese sovereignty, even though the leader is definitely pro-independence. He has a record of being a pro-independence activist. To get concessions from them, or under the idea that the Taiwanese, through risk aversion, will see that the Chinese are, violating the airspace more and more, or violating this median line, and maybe themselves, through self-preservation and not wanting the confrontation, will pull back to try to avoid the risk brinkmanship. The Chinese move a piece forward, the Taiwanese move a piece back. The Taiwanese might have taken an L in this engagement, but they would have avoided a war. And so they might think that the risk itself might act as a disincentive for the Taiwanese to hold the line. Of course, I'm reading a lot right now into intentions, and I am not the Chinese government. I cannot tell you what all of their intention is, but the point is, one way or the other, the Chinese are not happy with this line, and they are violating it with their aircraft, and an intention to either make it null, void, and pointless, or for some other different outcome. But they want it gone.
U.S. in the 1950s. China's military says the boundary is nothing more than part of its territory.
台湾是中国领土不可分割的一部分，根本不存在所谓的海峡中线。
But Taiwan says the median line is integral to preventing conflict as it establishes limits and boundaries for both sides.
Like you need a boundary, or the ships are going to ram each other. The planes they're going to confront more, and the more chances you give for an accident to happen, then eventually at a certain point, you might just be playing a waiting game. And you do not want to get to that point where you're playing chicken with each other when one power is a nuclear power and the other is backed by another nuclear power. And Taiwan, if you exclude the mountainous environments, is one of the most dense urban environments in the world. So any bombing campaign is going to be horrifically destructive for the civilian population, for the economy. I think the Bloomberg, and I do want to bring this up because I don't know when else I'll be able to bring up this data again. Bloomberg published some data that I found fascinating on the effects of the economy, on the American economy, on the Chinese economy, and on the Taiwanese economy if there was to be a war between China and Taiwan. And it's not completely surprising, the data, but it does show that there is definitely a steep incentive by all sides, but especially from the Chinese and Taiwanese, to avoid a violent end to the Taiwanese crisis. So here's the data I wanted to show you guys. Here's two graphs that I thought were very illuminating. So there's two scenarios that are modeled out by Bloomberg, the news outlet. If you wanted the source on here from it, it's Bloomberg Economics. And the two scenarios is a Chinese invasion draws the US into a local conflict. So that means China, Taiwan at war, and now the United States has come into the fray, and they're going to be fighting as well. And then there's another scenario where the Chinese blockade Taiwan.
3 has donated $50. Thank you for everything you do, Dylan. I found you during Hippy Dippy, but I'm so glad you started covering more international relations news. And obviously
for all the coverage you do in Ukraine. Why, thank you, Echo0083. Very specific name, but I do appreciate the $50. Appreciate the birthday gift. I feel like the most special birthday boy in the world. Thank you. So they run two scenarios here. A Chinese invasion drawing the US into a local conflict, and China blockading Taiwan. Now, if China blockades Taiwan, these will be the economic effects of that according to Bloomberg Economics. Of course, we can't know the exact state of the economy at the time of the blockade being enacted. We can only exist in the here and now. We cannot know all of the effects. It would depend on different military actions, what time of the year the blockade was enacted, how much time Taiwan had to prepare for a blockade, if the blockade would come in surprise, if the blockade would, the blockade's going to come in the next few weeks, we better prepare. It would depend on a bunch of different factors. But it would, number one, come with And this comes to the year one modeling assumptions. 100% of cut in trade with Taiwan between Taiwan and China and the rest of the world makes sense. Because, of course, if they're blockaded, they can't trade with anyone else. And this is going to be one of the biggest problems that Taiwan faces in a scenario where China blockades them, is the fact that they're going to have to survive, at least for a bit, on their own until that blockade is broken, either by the Chinese giving up or by, you know, the Americans breaking the blockade, however they would want to achieve it, or through some negotiated settlement. 50% of tariffs between the U.S. and China would be hit. 25% of the tariffs between U.S. allies in China, and a 16-point spike in VIX. Now, the GDP impact, and this is the thing that I think is going to be more communicatable for everyday people, is going to be, number one, in Taiwan, a 12.2% reduction in GDP. This is bad. This is really bad. This is awfully bad. Now, I will say, in comparison to what the Ukrainians faced, you can see the difference between a blockade and an invasion, because the Ukrainians faced in their first year a reduction of around, I think it was like 30 to 45 or 40% in GDP. So you can see the difference between a blockade, still economically devastating with a 12.2% in GDP reduction, but different than a war. 8.9%, and this is the thing.
Has donated $20. Happy B-Day.
Thank you for the $20, Joylyn. I really appreciate that, buddy. You could have given that $20 to anybody, but you decided to give it to me on my birthday, or I guess my day after my birthday. But still, I appreciate it. Thank you. Now, this is the interesting part. While Taiwan loses 12.2% of its GDP, mainland China loses 8.9%. China loses 8.9% of its GDP. So as much as a blockade on Taiwan is going to hurt the Taiwanese, it's going to hurt the Chinese a lot as well. And that's not surprising, considering that Taiwan's main trading partner is China. And this again shows that it's in the interest of both the Taiwanese and the Chinese, from an economic sense, to maintain the peace, to not have a blockade, to not drag this out into either a blockade or a full-on war, which we'll discuss in a moment. In the United States, we're more isolated from it, but it does not leave us alone either. And this shows that we truly live in a globalized society. Even for those who want to isolate America from the world still affects the United States. A 3.3% reduction in GDP in the United States. To be clear, right now we're going through a 3.4% increase in GDP in the United States. So we'd have to flip those numbers to get to this scenario, so to get an idea about how economically devastating that would be, and a general 5% reduction in GDP across the world. So we would be, compared to the world, able to isolate ourselves more on average when it comes to GDP percentage reduction. But I think a lot of this is concentrated within, of course, mainland China, being one of the largest countries in the world and with in the largest population. Now, this gets drastically worse if it goes out into a full-blown war. Let's say the Chinese blockade Taiwan, but then the Taiwanese DPP government doesn't concede. They say, no, we're not going to give you Taiwan. We will not secede to you. We will defend our island. We will defend our democracy. Or if the Chinese decide to skip the blockade altogether and just do a full surprise landing, hoping that the Taiwanese will be caught off guard. Whatever the scenario is, of course, you still have the 100% cut in trade with Taiwan, but this also means a near 100% cut in U.S.-China trade, because this also draws the U.S. into a local conflict in this scenario. So this does not just mean no trade with Taiwan. This means no trade between the United States and China, and that will, of course, be economically devastating for both parties. A 50% reduction in tariffs between the U.S. allies in China. 50% tariffs between the U.S. and China, 40-point spike in VIX, and 80% cut in trade to and from Japan, Korea, and Asian nations. Now over to the GDP impact. Taiwan is the one that is most devastated by its loss of GDP in this scenario, with 40% of its GDP going away. And for mainland China, for the communist government in Beijing, I don't know if we're going to call it communist government. I never know because it says mainland China here, and that's the term I keep using, but I could use the word China as well. But then if I use that, some people might not know if I mean like China is in Taiwan because so I'm just going to refer to it as they refer to it in the document. Mainland China, 16.7% reduction in GDP. That is economically devastating. In fact, that would be as economically devastating for mainland China. No, worse. It would be more economically devastating for mainland China for them to go to war with Taiwan than it would be for Taiwan if China was just to blockade them. It's worse for mainland China if they go to war with Taiwan than what it would be for Taiwan if they were blockaded. To give you an idea of how devastating the economic consequences of them not only losing their trade with Taiwan, which 50% of Taiwanese trade is with China, but they would also, of course, be losing their trade with the United States. They would be losing trade with American allies. Trade in the region is generally going to go down because who's going to want to ship in an area where two gigantic powers are throwing at each other in the ocean? So it's going to have a devastating effect on Taiwan, with its economy looking to see a GDP reduction similar to what Ukraine saw, and China seeing a 16.7% reduction in GDP in year one, mind you. Mind you, this is year one. So we're not talking about possible negative impacts going into year two or year three. We're just talking year one. The United States would see its negative economic effect doubled from just losing 3.3% of GDP to 6.7% of GDP. And the world, even less isolated from it, would see a 10.2% reduction in GDP, 1/10. 1/10. So I think this clearly shows that a war between Taiwan and China would be economically disastrous, but not only a war between Taiwan and China, even though that is one of the most devastating scenarios when the United States gets involved and we have this big war, but also a blockade on Taiwan alone would be economically disastrous for the world. It'd be economically disastrous for Taiwan. It'd be economically disastrous for mainland China. It'd be economically disastrous for the United States, and it'd be economically disastrous for the world as a whole, especially seeing that Taiwan is a large microchip manufacturer. And when you look at the top tier microchips, the ones that are of the highest quality, they will often be from Taiwan. They help, I don't want to use the word flood, but heavily supply the international microchip market, even to the point where you were finding Taiwanese microchips in Russian weapons being used against Ukraine. Now, this wasn't some deal between the Taiwanese government to supply the microchips. And in fact, the Taiwanese government is now trying to block microchips from getting to Russia to be used in drones and rockets that are fired at Ukraine. But that's just to show that its microchips really can be found everywhere. And so that's one thing that's particularly going to be a hit not only to the world economy, but the American economy. And that's part of the reason why the United States has started to invest domestically in chip production for either a blockade, war, or general scenario where, hey, we need a short supply line for our weapons. We need these microchips. Let's make them domestically. So I think this shows clearly that is in the interest of no one for a war between Taiwan and China to take place. Another graph I wanted to show you from the Bloomberg report is comparing the global GDP hit of a war and the risk of that war, i.e., like what's going to be the impact on the global economy in comparison to other crises. And they have a few comparisons here, which they compared to the Taiwan War, including the ongoing Israel-Hamas war. As you can see, has had it's seemingly less than a single percentage point impact on negative impact on GDP globally. Then you've got the September 11th attacks, which seem to be a little bit more sizable than the Israel-Hamas war. Then the Gulf War, sizable than 9/11. You're starting to get, 1, 2, maybe 3 percentage points. Then you have the Taiwan blockade scenario. The Taiwan blockade scenario, according to Bloomberg, would have more of a negative economic impact on global GDP than the Israel-Hamas war, the September 11th attacks, and the Gulf War. And this isn't even a war. This is just a blockade. Then you go all the way past COVID-19. Then you go all the way to the other end of this graph, and you arrive at the Taiwan War at negative 10%. I will say that Taiwan has a big advantage in one area, and that is economic deterrence when it comes to the rest of the world. The rest of the world does not have formal diplomatic ties with Taiwan, and a lot of them have to do diplomacy through back channels, or as the United States does it, through a private institute. And its relationship with a lot of the world is strained in part due to deliberate policy and agenda by Beijing in order to isolate them internationally. Ever since the decision in 1979 to boot the Taiwanese off of the UN seat for China and replace it with the government in Beijing, or as mainland China, as the Bloomberg article calls it. So I think when you look at this economic impact, that when people say, "Oh, this isn't really our business." Number one, it literally affects our business very directly, as you can see. And the United States has played a pivotal role in making sure that the status quo across the Taiwan state has stayed ever since the crisis in the 1950s and ever since the Taiwan Relations Act was passed in 1979 during the tail end of the Carter administration as a concession to the House and Senate, which wanted more protections for Taiwan, as the presidency was much less willing to concede. I think it was at the end of the Carter administration. I got to remember, it's 1979. I was not even close to being born. So I hope this gives you an idea of the negative impacts of how a crisis like this could spiral into something that has global implications. So 2 fishermen or 3 fishermen dying after they went into what would be considered by the Taiwanese to be their water space might not seem like it's that important to somebody halfway across the world, but I can tell you, in a truly globalized planet, it does have an impact. And we should be paying attention and doing our best to preserve the status quo, in my opinion, and to avoid a disastrous and deadly world, which would have horrible, horrible international implications, and most devastatingly, a horrific war for those on the ground.